Hi, everyone. This is Caron Whitaker with the League. I'll get started in just a second.
No.
Hi, Karen. There we go. Okay, you should all be able to see the screen now.
Yeah.
Good.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Had me a bit scared. I had a lot of trouble getting in this time for some reason.
Oh, no. Well, I'm glad you made it. I still have people entering, so I'm gonna give it one more second. In fact, 1 second, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can turn off the doorbell. And then all right, well, thanks everyone for joining. My name is Caron Whitaker. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at the League of American Bicyclists, and I handle the federal policy work. So thanks for joining. I'm gonna talk us through the asks for the National Bike Summit this year, and then we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. And thanks everyone for registering for the summit and for the lobby day. It really makes a difference. The last few years, we had a couple of asks and we got them all into the transportation bill. And that is just something that, you know, a lot of people, when they're thinking about transportation, they don't necessarily think about biking and walking. And the thing that can make a difference is hearing from their constituents. So really appreciate you all being here and coming to the summit. So tonight, I want to talk a little bit about how the asks that we have for this year fit into the transportation bill that just passed, the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Talk about the two programs we're going to be asking for funding for. One is the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, and the other is the Healthy Streets Program. And then I'll go over making the ask, because this year, oops, went back one. This year, it's a little bit different. Usually we're asking for a bill to become part of the transportation bill. Now we're talking about a couple of programs that were in the transportation bill but didn't get funded. So, and I will send the slides and the fact sheets and everything at the end, but also have put the websites here. Okay, so just as we're getting started, Congress and the administration call the bill two different things. So it's the bipartisan infrastructure law or the bipartisan infrastructure bill. That is how the administration is referring to it now. So if you've been on any of my other webinars recently, I've been talking about it as such, but Congress still goes by their name, which is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So you might hear both terms at the summit. In your Hill meetings, I would stick with IIJA or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, because we're talking to Congress and that's the name they gave it. But you might hear Secretary Buttigieg talk about it as the bill or the bipartisan infrastructure law. Okay, so just quickly, when we look at what's in the bill for bikes, we did really well. There's a huge increase in funding. There's improvements to the safety program. There's better planning data. There's a complete streets requirement. It's a climate title. I've gone through a lot of this in other webinars. I'm not going to go through it all now, but I just want to remind folks that it's a really good bill. And if it comes up in your meetings, it's something we support. And if your member of Congress voted for it, it's something to thank them for. So, but there's still some work to do, specifically these two programs that I mentioned that were authorized but not appropriated. And what that means, authorized means that the policy was created, the program was created, But appropriations is when they put money towards it. So these two programs were created, but not funded. So nothing can happen until we get them some funding. And that means that this year we're going to have to ask for funding in the budget process and the appropriations process. They're the same process. The budget is when we're talking really big picture. The appropriations process is when they get down to funding each individual program. So this is something that we'll have to ask for funding for every year, but the first year is always the hardest. If you can get it funded one year, it's always easier than to go back and ask for funding the second year. So a couple of comments on why they weren't funded, because in general, the vast majority of transportation projects and programs that are funded in the transportation bill get funded for 5 years. It's the money that we pay in gas tax goes to a trust fund, which is like a bank account for transportation, and most of the programs come out of that. So all of the transportation alternatives funding, the safety funding, the new climate funding, congestion funding, that all comes out of that. But the two programs I'm going to talk about now, they had limited support. They're new programs. It's always harder to get new programs into the transportation bill. And that while they both did have some bipartisan support, they didn't quite have enough to get them over the hump to get the funding. And so, but we're still glad that they were created. And why would Congress create them but not fund them? One, it's a compromise. But two, the transportation bill only comes around every 5 to 7 years. And so if getting them created means we have 5 to 7 years to push to get them funded. If that didn't happen, we'd have to wait the 5 to 7 years to just ask for it again. So getting it authorized is a really important first step. Okay, so to talk about the programs, the first one I'm going to talk about is the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, or the ATIIP program. And this is a bike map of Washington, DC. So this program, it's a discretionary grant program through the US DOT. And by discretionary grant program, that means that communities applying for it would apply directly to US DOT, directly to Buttigieg and their staff. And the goal of it is really, it's a big program so that if a community gets a grant, they could build out their biking and walking network within the community, or they could build a spine between communities. And the grant would be 15 million or more. 15 million is the floor of the size of the grant. And that's very different from transportation alternatives, which is what we often talk about. Transportation alternatives is one project at a time. It gets a little bit of money to communities all over the place. This would give a couple of communities a big grant to really build out a lot of their network all at once, right? So that's the goal, to build out or finish networks and spines quickly instead of having to apply project by project. Now, last year we talked about this as Connecting America's Active Transportation System. So you may have heard of that bill. When they did authorize it, they changed the name to ATIIP, or Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program. So to give an example of that, okay, so eligible entities, all levels of local government, community, state, regional, tribal, they're eligible. And the program would look at criteria such as how well would this project connect people to everyday destinations like school, work, shopping, how much support do they have by the community? How much did they get public input in planning it? How well does it address equity disparities? So is the program going to help all neighborhoods of the community or communities that have maybe been underserved in the past? And then how well does it address safety, environmental sustainability, and quality of life? So I want to give the example of Oakland, California, and just look at a couple of decades of their bikeways, because they've really been trying to build it up. So this is what it looked like in 2000. We had some bike routes, a couple of bike paths, but not a ton. In 10 years, they really built it up more. They got a lot more bike lanes in there. But then between 2010 and 2020, they really started building it out. And it's made a world of difference for the city, but it took them 20 years. Imagine if they had been able to really build that network in 5 years, get one big grant and really build that. That's what this program is about. The other thing is looking at this map. Imagine what they could do now if they got a big grant. They could connect all those pieces that are still hanging out there. So that's what we're looking for in terms of networks. In terms of spines, I want to give an example from Delaware. This is the coast of Delaware. There's two communities here, Lewis up north, Rehoboth Beach to the south. They're both touristy communities, but they're great places to visit, great places to live. But they're only 4 miles apart, but the only road that connects them is this arterial that looks like this. And so it's 4 miles apart, but unless you can drive, there's really no safe way to get there. Or there wasn't until they built the bike trail that you see in orange right here. And so that's what we're thinking about in terms of spines. If you lived in Lewis and wanted to work in Rehoboth or vice versa, and you didn't have a car, maybe you could take the bus, but the bus isn't, bus service wasn't great. The trail really makes a difference in that way. The other thing about building spines is that spines can be connected to create a larger trail network. So this is something like the East Coast Greenway or the Great American Rail Trail. And I wanted to put in this Great American Rail Trail. This is from Rails to Trails, because Rails to Trails was really the impetus for this whole active transportation infrastructure investment program. So we really appreciate them doing that. Now we want to help get it over the line. So a little bit about the funding. The way the bill is written, at least 30% would have to go to communities wanting to build out their networks. At least 30% would go to spines. And then the other 40% could be either. It does in general require a local match of 20%. But if the project runs through areas, or the majority of areas that it runs through have a community of 40% or more living in poverty, then it could be 100% federally funded. And there's also funding there for grants. So a community could the first year apply to get a grant, plan out where they would want their network, and then apply for funding the next year to build it out. Right. So again, it was introduced as the Connecting America's Active Transportation System. In the Senate, it was bipartisan. Senator Markey from Massachusetts, Senator Sullivan from Alaska, and Van Hollen from Maryland introduced it. In the House, it wasn't bipartisan, but nothing in transportation was bipartisan, or very little. And it was Representatives Pappas from New Hampshire and Huffman from California. And it's interesting because Markey was really thinking about the networks, but Pappas from New Hampshire was really thinking about the East Coast Greenway. So we had advocates for both the networks and then the spines. So in the House bill, it was included in the House bill. And so, but in the Senate bill, we got to the end of the debate, it was left out. There was a lot of work really trying to convince the senators on the committee to put it in, but there was some concern, even from the leading Republican in particular, Senator Capito, but from others that they had already done just too much for biking and walking, and they really didn't need to put more money into it. So that's why their compromise was to authorize it at $200 million a year. So our ask for the appropriations is to fully fund this program. And we're saying fully fund because some people might think fully fund is 500 and some think it might be 200. And we want to leave a little bit of ambiguity, because if we say 500, we're not clear that all the sponsors would support it. So we're going to say fully fund and hope we get at least 200 million a year and hopefully more. The Appropriations Committee, sometimes they will go beyond what the authorizing number is in the bill. So in talking about this bill, in your summit meetings, there's a couple of things to think about. Think about areas in your community where you may have some bike lanes or sidewalks or trails, but they don't completely connect. And so you want to get them to connect. Or areas where it's unsafe. We all know those places where your destination, like in that Delaware map, it might be 4 miles away. It's not that bad a bike ride. But even if just a mile of it or a half mile of it feels really unsafe, you may be unwilling to do it, or people may be unwilling to bike. Or it could just be a mile walk away and people won't do it because there's a really dangerous road they have to cross, or an area without a sidewalk or something like that. So think about those areas that you can talk about with your member of Congress. If your community has a bike map or a bike plan that talks about where they want to build it, you could talk about that. If you have one that just shows the maps, like in Oakland, you can talk about, see all these places where we could connect it and make it safer. All of that's important. Also, if you can think about the benefits to safety, to climate, to equity, and do a little bit of research on your membership, see what they care about. If you can connect it to economic development or small businesses, just about every member of Congress is going to care about that. I just want to show an example. So this is Washington, D.C. This is the Capitol Trails Coalition map. The green is where there are already trails, and the orange is what they're trying to build. So bringing something like this into the office can give the staff or the member of Congress a sense of what you're talking about. And for those who might be coming in person, there is going to be a mobile workshop by the Capitol Trails Coalition talking about how they created the coalition, and it will go up this green trail right here, which is the trail that kept me sane during COVID. So some potential questions you might get from those congressional offices when you're talking about this, you're going to get that major question like, didn't you already get everything in the bill? Like, why do you need more money? And there's a couple of things to talk about that. Transportation alternatives is where we got the biggest increase in money. But like I said before, transportation alternatives, it gets divvied out to the states, and then the states run grant programs. And communities apply for one project at a time. It might be a mile of sidewalk. It might be the first stage in a trail. It might be a couple of miles of bike lane, but it gets a little bit of money everywhere. And that's really important. But this program does something a little bit different. It gives a larger funding to a few areas to really jump ahead and to be those examples moving forward. And that is not unusual. The bill, the IIJA, it doubles up on formula and discretionary programs in other areas too. So there's a bridge discretionary program and there's a bridge formula program. There's a rural discretionary grant program and a rural formula program. So we are not asking for anything unusual. And I also think that, again, we just saw the fatality numbers coming up. Bicyclists and pedestrians, vulnerable road users, we're still seeing an increase in fatalities and a really high level of biking and walking fatalities. This DOT has put that as a major focus, and that's a reason to do this. It gives them an additional tool in their toolbox. So safety and economic development are things that should work in most offices, but if you have a member of Congress who really cares about health or climate, that's something to do. That's something else. The other thing they may say is, well, there's already the RAISE grant program out there. Why do you need one specific to biking and walking? And it's true. And we have done well under RAISE. We did well in this administration under that. But the RAISE program is specifically for multimodal projects. So things that are, complete streets, or a transit center that has bike share at it and things like that. It's for multimodal projects like that and multi-jurisdictional projects. So projects that cut across political lines. So that's really the goal of that. And RAISE is also extremely oversubscribed. And again, because of that need for safety, because of the real emphasis on safety or climate, if those are the things your members care about, this makes sense to help with those. So these are a couple of questions. I did this once a couple of years ago, and then after Hill Day, someone came up to me and said, my member of Congress asked me a bunch of questions that weren't on your list. That is going to happen. That's okay. If you don't know the answer, just say, look, I don't have an answer to that. Can I get back with you on that? Can I get back to you on that? And then you can ask me and we can figure it out, and then you can go back with an answer. Don't worry about that. These are two questions that I'm anticipating. So I just wanted to put those out there. So that's the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program. So the next program I want to talk about is this Healthy Streets program. And I'm really excited about this because I think it's a really creative program and something a little different than we've seen in transportation bills in the past. And the goal of this is really to reduce flooding, improve air quality, and mitigate the urban heat island effect, specifically at transit stops and sidewalks and walkways, and specifically in low-income communities and communities of color. It's part of the thinking that's been going on that, hey, you know, some of the infrastructure we've built in the past has not been equitable. So how can we go back and look at that and improve it for underserved communities? So the urban heat island effect is this concept that occurs in areas that have been basically paved over. So where cities have replaced natural land cover like trees and grass or whatever was there with asphalt. And those dark surfaces can really absorb the heat a lot more than those green surfaces do. And so it can make an area significantly warmer than it would be otherwise. And it's something that happened particularly, you know, in the 70s, 80s, maybe a little in the 90s, when we weren't thinking about that quite as much. And what the result of that is that cities have become increasingly hot, less equitable, and also more prone to flooding, because if there's no natural surfaces, there's no place for that water to go. And we do see that low-income community neighborhoods are often 8 to 10 degrees warmer than surrounding areas. And they also often just have worse air quality. And so while this bill specifically talks about transit stops and walkways, we also know those same areas are a lot less comfortable to bike in. So what this bill does is it would fund, again, state, tribal, local government, or even a nonprofit, at least for the first part, to expand tree coverage. And I know DC, we have a group called KC Trees that helps the city out by purchasing and planting trees, but also to deploy smart surfaces. In the last 50 years, the technology around asphalt and concrete and things like that has really changed. And we know a lot more now. So you can do green roofs and put plants in a garden almost on top of a roof. You can also use reflective surfaces, and that will reflect the sun's heat back up in the sky and off of that ground. It can really reduce extreme heat. We also know that porous surfaces can reduce flooding and standing water, and particularly when you're talking about a trail or a sidewalk where you're not going to have those heavy trucks. This is a technology that can really help with some of those issues. So a couple of examples. So this is a map of Phoenix and the bus stops, and they were looking at LST is the land surface temperature. They were looking at these in the summer. And so all of these dots represent a bus stop where the temperature is between 118 to 134 degrees in the summer. And you can imagine if you're waiting for a bus for 15 or 20 minutes, that's pretty miserable, right? And it's just unhealthy. You've got the unhealthy air. You've also got makes you more prone to heat exhaustion or heat stroke and things like that. One of the things they found in Phoenix is that unhoused people would often, or people experiencing homelessness, would go to shelters for a little relief and then could succumb to heat stroke. So the city started with a pilot program. Oops. Sorry. Start with the pilot program. Spraying on just this lighter surface. And so that they spray it on, and talking to the city, they wanted me to show the picture where you can see the difference in color, but you can also see the neighborhood. There's not a lot of trees. There's not a lot of shade. Before they put on the lighter color, there was a lot of dark asphalt reflecting on it. So they went through, they did, I think, 5 or 6 areas, some of them in parks, some of them around transit stops, and put in this other surface. And the result, just by painting it, was a drop of between 10 and 15 degrees. And while 106 or 111 still seems hot, it does seem better than 121. And it's a start. It's not the full solution, but it's part of the solution. And so this is something that can happen. Phoenix is really worried about climate change and increasing temperatures. And so this went from a pilot program to a regular program where they're trying to do this all over the city, because reducing 10 to 15 degrees is a start. And then they can do some other things along with it.
Sorry to interrupt. This is Douglas Cobb. I just had a question. Are you going to provide these slides too? Because this would be great information just for it. These are important things like Healthy Streets program. While it's obviously something that we're advocating at Bike Summit, this is something that cities across the country should be doing as a whole. And I think a lot of people, like Phoenix and the West Coast, is very progressive with this kind of stuff. But even here in Florida, as crazy as it sounds, we have crazy hot temperatures. I'm here in Miami, and this is just something that is really not done right now and should be. So
yeah. I will be
sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. And I'll have plenty of time at the end for Q&A too. I will provide the slides, and the fact sheets also have a couple of these examples.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. So another one I want to talk about is Reading, Pennsylvania, and their complete streets policy. So in 2010, they were rated the poorest mid-sized city in the country. They're now the 7th poorest, so some improvement. But in 2015, they decided they were going to go forward with the complete streets policy. And their policy is so good, it was deemed, or got best in nation status by the Smart Growth America and the National Complete Streets Coalition. And one of the things they did that helped it gain that was they went beyond just transportation goals, but also to include the goals of reducing stormwater runoff. And that's important for environmental reasons, but it's also important for transportation, especially for those of us who travel outside of cars. I was actually looking for a free picture of someone getting splashed while biking or walking on the sidewalk. We've all been there. And I couldn't find it, but just that's the kind of thing when we talk about trying to get people out of cars, those sorts of situations are going to stop people from doing it. And then the people that don't have cars, just don't have access to cars, choose not to drive cars, and that's their only option. You know, our transportation system, yes, needs to be safe and have access, but it also should supply a certain amount of dignity in transportation. And having to bike, walk through puddles, getting splashed by cars on your way to work really takes away from that. And so the idea of addressing stormwater for all the environmental reasons we need to do it is important, but it's also important for meeting our climate change goals in transportation, for just the simple dignity of people getting to where they need to go. And then a final example, this was in Miami-Dade. It's called the SHADE Project, the Shaping Healthy, Active, Deep-Rooted Environments Project. Clearly, they had the acronym before the name. But the goal of this was really to increase physical activity through active transportation and to improve air quality. So they wanted to focus on access to transit stops, and they went to communities, Little Havana and Miami Gardens, where a lot of the people do rely on transit, biking, and walking. And they got a lot of community buy-in on, if we're going to plant trees, where would you want them? Would this improve your commute? How should this work? So they got community buy-in, they got volunteer efforts to plant the trees, and they planted 142 trees specifically on routes to transit and to shopping areas. And it was a successful project, and what they learned from it is that we can scale up. And we know that that trees do a lot of, we think of shade as a nice to have or a comfort piece, but again, in places with these really high temperatures in Miami, in Phoenix, in other desert communities, it's more than just a nice to have, it becomes a health issue, right? And also a lot of what we do when we think about biking and walking, yes, we think mostly about transportation, or we work mostly on transportation, but we also think about it in terms of physical activity and the health benefits. And so being able to reduce excessive heat, being able to reduce flooding, encourages people to bike and walk more. So there's 3 examples. Those 3 are on the fact sheet, which we'll have for the summit. We also, in working on this, I worked with the Smart Surface Coalition, and they did a report in Baltimore where they showed that if they could convert a certain percentage of surfaces to smart surfaces, it would be more than a 4% degree cooling down of downtown Baltimore, creates jobs, it improves air quality, and mitigates stormwater runoff and encourages biking and walking. So they were talking about green roofs, they were talking about planting trees, they were talking about white roofs and those reflective surfaces. So there's been a lot of study that this can really make a difference. A little bit about how this program came about and why it's authorized but not funded. Part of it is it's kind of a new idea. It's not necessarily creating new transportation infrastructure, but it's taking the infrastructure we have and making it better. It was created by the chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, Tom Carper, who is from Delaware, and his staff, and they worked on it with American Forests and the Smart Surface Coalition. But at the time they were writing it, they didn't really have a transportation advocacy organization. And so they didn't have what we call a marker bill. So when you think about the changes we made to safety and the changes we made to transportation alternatives, we had bills. And so last year when you came to Congress, you went and talked about transportation alternatives, and you talked about our safety plan, and you talked about complete streets. And so a lot of offices heard about it. This was started by the chairman, didn't really have that advocacy support. So when they got the compromise, the bipartisan compromise to put it in and authorized, that was great. We got it in. But now as we go into appropriations, this one is a little bit further behind because it hasn't had the advocacy. All the other offices haven't heard about it. And so this is one that we're gonna have to talk about. The good news is that Secretary Buttigieg was testifying just last week, I think, in front of the Environment and Public Works Committee. And one of the questions was, so what's in the bill to help with climate? And he mentioned this program. And I'm hoping that by mentioning the program, that means that he also tried to get it into the president's budget. So from where we started, I think when we picked it up sort of after the bill passed, it was behind, but if it now has the secretary's support, it might be okay. So it's one of the things I'm watching, waiting for the president's budget. I'll talk about that in a minute. But when the infrastructure bill was coming through and we had the Build Back Better bill, there was a lot of news coverage about, all the crazy things in the bill, including tree equity. And this was one of the programs they were talking about. There's other programs in Build Back Better that also talk about tree planting. So that's where the numbers are, but we saw it a lot on the conservative news side. And then these are some tweets from Republican senators also showing some concern about it, right? So I put that out there just to say we need to be careful about how we talk about tree equity versus reducing urban heat island and things like that. So in talking about it, I would say look for examples from your state and your district. And I realize this is a bit harder for rural communities, but you may find flooding of infrastructure there. Or you might find some, or urban heat islands. This is, again, a picture from Miami where it floods even in sunny weather. And you've got your pedestrian crossing there. Again, probably doable, right? It's, you're not gonna, doesn't look like someone's gonna drown, probably doable. But again, when you talk about that dignity of transportation, that's not there. So in talking about this bill, really focusing on the equity of improving air quality and health outcomes, viable access to transportation, and providing that dignity transportation for everyone. Our transportation system needs to work for everyone and across modes, whether they're biking, walking, transit, taking, driving. You shouldn't show up, you shouldn't have to show up at work wet to your knees. The other issue, of course, is climate. When we talk about climate resiliency, this is because they're in the middle of an urban heat island, we need to find ways to mitigate that. And if we want to be serious about climate, we're going to have to do more than just electrified cars. We're going to have to reduce vehicle miles traveled. And to do that, we really need safe and reliable and comfortable options. People aren't going to choose always to, to walk and bike in these sorts of situations. A little bit of data that you can look up, and I will send this website to you as well, but climatecentral.org. This is Columbus, Ohio. And so for cities, they will have these three facts for each of them, that in Columbus, areas of Columbus can be 24 degrees hotter than in nearby rural areas. But on average, the cities can be 4.5 degrees higher than rural areas. And that Columbus has 16 more days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit than nearby rural areas. So we see the difference. This site says that Columbus is number 8 with the biggest differences. So there's different facts to think about. I would also just say that within the city, there's going to be significant variation. Another thing to look at is tree coverage. And this is, the site is called treeequityscore.org. It's created by American Forests, one of the groups that helped create the law. And this is interesting because you can get these charts that compare tree canopy to people in poverty or percent of people in communities of color for any district, for any congressional district, any city, or your state. And so again, for rural areas, I think this can help because in almost every single district, you're gonna see some disparity. There's gonna be somewhere where this can help. So this is looking at Lexington, Kentucky. So you can see the more green, the more tree coverage, the better tree equity score, the more brown, the less. And so on this chart over here, where you're looking at tree canopy versus people in color, people in poverty, excuse me, this 0 to 20% says in communities where 0 to 20% of the population is living in poverty, their tree canopy is is significantly above average. It's above average, even for the 20 to 40% of people living in poverty, it's above average. The line is average. But then when you get down to communities that are 80 to 100% living in poverty, you see a significant difference. It's much lower. And one thing I'll say, when you're looking at the state or a district that is more rural, sometimes on this one, you'll get a U-shape effect, where in some of the communities of poverty, if are rural, may have more trees. So you're looking at sort of this 40 to 80% when you're talking to someone. But this is a really interesting site. It takes a little doing. We're going to have a blog out in a couple of days to help you figure out how to use the site. But it's really interesting to look at places where you live or places where you visited and compare. So in terms of an answer on what is tree equity, the American forest definition is enough trees in specific neighborhoods or municipalities for everyone to enjoy the health, economic, and climate benefits trees provide. But so what I would say, if you're getting a question about tree equity, you want to say, yeah, this is about that. It is about everyone getting those benefits. But this bill is about more than that. It's about climate resiliency, specifically at or near transit stops and walkways, transportation infrastructure, in low-income neighborhoods and where people may not have other transportation options. For our transportation system to work, it has to work for everyone. Flooding and excessive heat are health and safety dangers. So that's my suggestion. I will say climate resiliency is something that is supported across the political spectrum. So that's a way to talk about this if you're getting some pushback. Potential questions. You might get a question, is this really a transportation priority? Again, I would talk about our system is supposed to be providing safe and accessible transportation for everyone, and these things threaten that. You might get a question about, there's got to be other programs in the bill that cover this. And there is another program, the PROTECT program, that addresses resiliency. But I would argue that this is a specific problem when you talk about transit stops and walkways that has just been overlooked for decades. And this program is authorized at $100 million a year, which I know sounds like a lot of money, but really it's basically a pilot project. And so the idea of this program is let's show the benefits that this can happen. Let's give that example, and then maybe we'll see places really incorporate it both into fixing infrastructure that now is inequitable, or when they're creating new infrastructure, bring in some of those ideas. And I will say, I do recognize that this ask is going to be harder for districts that don't have urban areas, but I would consider thinking about the flooding argument, if that affects it, and that tree coverage map where you can show that there is a difference in different places in your district. So I just want to end on making the asks, because usually we're still going to be meeting with transportation staffers, but we are asking on the appropriations process. So the goal is to get funding for the program for the 2023 budget. And the fiscal year 2023 is going to run from October 1st, 2022 to September 30th, 2023. So we're asking now to get a program in place for starting in October. And that's good because Congress just finished the budget for the year that we're in. And so they're just starting now to talk about this. And asking for them to support this, it's a lot like the co-sponsorship that we've had before, but it's already in law. So we're not asking for co-sponsorship. We're asking them to support programs. We may be asking them to sign a letter in support. And just so you know, this bill is going to go through the Transportation, HUD Appropriations Subcommittee or the THUD Subcommittee. And part of the process, what we're waiting for now is for the president to release his budget for the 2023 year. He usually does it around the State of the Union, but because they hadn't finished this year's budget, the White House has held off. We do expect that to come out before the summit. When that comes out, we'll see where we are. If these programs have funds, then it's a little bit of an easier ask to ask Congress to keep it in. If it doesn't have funds, we're going to have to ask to really get it in. So the second ask would be for congressional offices, when the budget comes out, we have offices lined up that they're going to write what's called a Dear Colleague letter, which they send out and they say to other members of Congress, please join me in asking for funding for this program. And so I don't know where we're going to be at the summit yet. So we'll have to see, and I will give you an update when we get there. But if those Dear Colleague letters are out, then the ask will be, will the Congress member sign on to the Dear Colleague letter supporting these programs? And if we don't have a Dear Colleague letter, we'll just say, will the Congress member support funding for these programs in the appropriations process? I like the letter better. It's a more direct ask. It's easier to track, but either will work. And what's going to happen when you make these asks is the staff is going to say, well, I need to go back and talk to my boss about it. That's fine. They will also suggest that you fill out their appropriations form. Most of these are online. This is one I just did. So put this up here. And they're going to ask questions about what's the name of the program, how much do you want it funded for, what subcommittee does it come in, all of that. If you could mute yourself, that would be helpful if you're not muted. So I will, within a week or so after the summit, I will get you the answers to most of those questions. Each form is a little bit different. It's okay to say, I don't know on something, they might contact you back, but they will ask you to fill out that form. I'll get you as much information as I can for that. So then you can just go through these forms and fill them out. And that would be super helpful in getting these projects funded. So for follow-up, we're going to ask that you fill out the form. And even when you do that, you still want to send an email, say, thanks for meeting with us. Here's the answers to those questions I didn't know before. Now that you've had a chance to talk to the senator, will they support these bills? Talk about why it's important to your district. The usual thank you letter. Let's say we get to the summit, the Dear Colleague letter hasn't come out. We just ask for support. The Dear Colleague letter comes out the next week. We're going to ask you to go back to your member of Congress and say, hey, will you sign this letter now? And then I always just want to make a plug for writing an article. If you're from an advocacy organization, for that e-news, if you're on Nextdoor or any other sort of neighborhood listserv, write a little blurb about that, write an op-ed for your paper. But hey, I went to Washington, I talked to so-and-so in the senator's office. These were the things I asked for. This is why I think they're really important. And then send that to the staffer so that they know that you're talking about this, that even more people are hearing about it. It can really make a difference. I've seen it get a member on board with something. So, okay, so that's the follow-up. Here are some resources. There's last week I did the webinar on how to lobby, how to research a member of Congress. That's available online, and I will send all of this to you. There's a blog we did on Bike Summit Prep on how to research a member of Congress. That you can look up your member of Congress. You can see if they've supported any of the bills that we supported last time. You can see if they voted for the infrastructure bill. You can see if they're on the Congressional Bike Caucus, all of those things in that blog. The fact sheets, there's one on each of these bills. There's, and then the two websites from the things I showed today on researching heat islands and tree cover in your city, district, or state. And then we're gonna, again, have a blog soon on how to use that website. So that's what I have. And yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and go to chat. So I gotta also, so please, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat or you can digitally raise your hand. We'll go there. I got a question from someone in Alaska who's curious about Sullivan's support and why he got involved and what groups were involved in convincing him. So what I'll say about Alaska is you have a pretty high bike and walk to work rate or number of trips taken biking and walking. So Sullivan has been fairly open to that. Murkowski has supported the bill as well. Even Don Young, your representative, has been helpful on Complete Streets. So there's that. I will also say that he is a staffer who is a regular bicyclist who also really gets this. So those things have combined to gain his support. All right. Okay, is the bill the Transportation Act? Yes. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law or the IIJA, they are the replacement for the FAST Act. So they are now law. And we're starting, so now that they're law, USDOT has to write guidance or instructions to states on how to implement it. They are working on that. Now that the budget has passed, all the new programs can come on board. So now we're going to see the climate programs. We're going to see there's a grant program for safety that's going to come on board. It's going to be a bunch of those. So yeah, so on Alaska, yeah, we can definitely talk about that relationship that's been built there. Yeah. Any other questions about the summit or lobbying?
Karen,
Yep.
it's Vivian. I'm just unmuting myself. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. That appropriations form, is that something that's existed forever? Because this is the first time I've ever seen that. Does like
So-
our state delegation fill one out for the whole group, or is that something that we do as individuals as well?
It's something you can do as individuals as well. We would want the organizations to fill it out as well. So it is something that has existed forever.
Oh,
In
okay.
general, most transportation funds don't have to go through the appropriations process. So we don't deal with it as much as other groups.
Okay,
have.
all right.
But if we were talking about health funding or education funding, they have to do it every single year.
All right, that's why it's not familiar to me. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
It's also the process for earmarks. So if your organization is interested in asking for an earmark, you also need to learn how to use the form. Okay, it says, what states are lacking in the Rails to Trails program? Okay, and tax credits for buying bikes. So states lacking, I'm not sure I understand the question about the Rails to Trails question, but yes, we do lobby for tax credits for buying bikes. There's two that were in Build Back Better that we care about. One was a bicycle commuter benefit, which we are working on and may be able to get in sort of under the radar. So we're not asking for that at this point. The other is the e-bike benefit, which I know a lot of people are really interested in. The status of that right now is that if we do see a big climate incentive bill, we hope to get the e-bike benefit in there. At this point, in talking to the sponsors, they don't really need a lot more sponsors, but one of the things we realized is that a lot of people that work on Capitol Hill, whether staff or members of Congress, are just completely unfamiliar with e-bikes. So we are working to have a ride Tuesday morning for staffers. You all are welcome to join, and we're going to have a bunch of e-bikes available to try. Now we're going to give congressional staffers and congressional members first dibs at trying those e-bikes. but they will be there. And then we're going to have them for folks who are in person, we'll have them at the summit after that for several hours if you want to try one. So that's one of the things we just need to get them to have that experience of being on an e-bike. We think that'll help make a difference.
May I say something? I
Sure.
had the question about the rails to trails, to
Yeah.
clarify rails to trails. I saw the map of rails to trails and it just looked like there's certain, rails to trails is being able to get on a bike and then on a train and go any place in the country by a bike train, right? But some states, like I'm from Illinois, it just seems like there's one small area in Illinois that prevents the trail from being completed. So it's like there's these little pockets across this, and I was just curious what is the holdup in getting those? Who is there one organization that does all of this?
So I would go to Rails to Trails Conservancy.
Yeah.
That's they will know more in detail what those issues are.
And so one last, I did see today that someone from Portland came up with a contraption where you can charge your e-bike at a station for charging a car, which
so
is
that-
a game changer.
So yes, and that is something we've been working with the EV coalitions to try to make that happen. There's also something in the Build Back Better, which would give tax credit to businesses that put in charging for e-bikes and other micromobility. So we are trying to do that as well.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions about the lobby asks or the summit that I can answer?
Karen, the handouts that go to the representatives,
Mm-hmm.
are those going to be provided, or is that going to be up to the state delegate to do that, to make a copy and send it to them?
Yeah, we're gonna just email it to everybody.
Okay.
To all the virtual meetings, and we're gonna email it. There will be some Senate in-person meetings. We'll also just email it all to staff. That's their preference now.
So they may, when we have our meetings, they may already have the handouts.
They should already have the handouts. It is unlikely that they will have focused on them.
Yeah,
So-
right.
So I'm gonna,
Karen,
sorry. Yep,
this is Steve Bingham. I put something in the chat. I guess you didn't see it, but I'm in Huffman's district and see that he co-authored, and he introduced Connecting America's Active Transportation System, and his press release suggests that it's the bill included appropriations in it. So my general question is, what bills include appropriations and which ones don't?
so, okay, so just for folks, oh, I somehow sent that to, so it is not in the bill for next year. It's something that we need to put in, get it in. I'll look at that. I didn't, but so I just put the fact sheets in the chat. So I will go back and look at the appropriations that just passed to make sure I'm right that it's not in there. I didn't see it in there. Either way, we still need to advocate to get it into next year's.
Yeah,
So
this
the way,
press release was from last year when you first
So-
introduced.
it was funded in the House bill,
Oh, I see.
but it wasn't in the final bill. And so, yeah, so I'll try to see if I can do just a short explainer about appropriations before the summit, so I can have that online so folks can see it, because of the Highway Trust Fund. The Highway Trust Fund was created and our gas taxes go into it and a few other taxes go into it to go to transportation. And they wanted to give certainty to states building roads because you never finish a transportation project in 1 year. And so they wanted to make sure that there would be certainty to finish the project over a number of years. So that the process of having one bill, one transportation bill that both creates the policy and funds it is very unique. But there's certain projects, but the transportation bill doesn't fund everything. It doesn't fund rail. There's a lot of transit that's not under the Highway Trust Fund that has to go through appropriations every year. And now we're going to have these programs, which are going to have to be funded every year through this second process. All right, it's 9 o'clock. So last call for questions. I will give an updated presentation on Sunday night at the summit, also virtual. By then I'll know if there's letters, and we'll talk through it a little bit more, and I'll be available through the summit to answer any questions. I have put the fact sheets in the chat, so you could download those, look at those. So also feel free to email me if you have any questions. I'll do my best to get back to you. If I don't get back to you before the summit, I'll try to either incorporate it into that presentation or be around over the summit, maybe create an FAQ or something like that. So thanks everyone for joining. I look forward to seeing you virtually or in person at the summit. And again, really appreciate you being here. We've seen this constituent advocacy really make a difference. And I think that both of these programs are on that cusp. I think we can really get them funded through this process. So I appreciate your help.
Okay.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you,
Welcome.
Karen.
Bye.
So helpful.
Thanks.